Some stories begin with a miracle, but this one begins with a chair that no one dared to touch. Every morning at exactly 8:10, when the smell of fresh coffee drifted out of a small cafe on Maple Street, and the soft hum of traffic rolled slowly through the quiet town of Ashford, a German shepherd appeared from the end of the sidewalk and walked with steady, patient steps toward the same table near the front window. He was a large dog, sable-coated with dark fur along his back and amber eyes that seemed to carry more memory than most people in town could understand. The first time anyone noticed him was early autumn, when the leaves had just started turning copper and gold. But after that morning he returned again and again, every single day, as reliable as the sunrise. The cafe owner, a middle-aged woman named Linda Harper, was the first to realize the dog wasn't wandering. He had a destination. He walked straight through the open patio gate, past the small chalkboard sign advertising pancakes and hot cider, and stopped beside a wooden chair that sat across from the table closest to the glass window. Then he sat down, not under the table like most dogs would, not begging for food. He sat beside the chair itself, tall and still, as if guarding a place meant for someone important. At first, people assumed he belonged to a nearby customer. But the minutes passed. Coffee cups were refilled, plates were cleared, and no one came to claim him. Yet the dog never acted lost. His eyes stayed fixed on the cafe door. Each time it opened, his ears lifted slightly, his body leaning forward with quiet anticipation before settling back again when a stranger stepped inside. The routine repeated day after day. 8:10 in the morning, like clockwork. The same dog, the same chair, the same silent vigil. People in town began to whisper about him. Some called him loyal. Others called it strange. But one thing became certain. No one ever sat in that chair anymore. Not because of a sign or a rule, but because something about the dog's presence made it feel like the seat already belonged to someone. A regular named Frank Dillard, a retired mechanic who drank black coffee every morning, once tried to pull the chair out so he could sit closer to the heater on a cold October morning. The dog didn't growl. He didn't bark. He simply lifted his head and looked at Frank with calm, steady eyes that carried a quiet kind of understanding. Frank slowly pushed the chair back into place and muttered under his breath, "All right, buddy, I guess I'll sit somewhere else." And so the chair remained empty, morning after morning, rain tapping softly against the cafe windows, frost gathering on the sidewalks when winter crept closer. Through it all, the German shepherd kept returning, sitting beside the same empty chair as if time itself were waiting with him. No one in Ashford knew the full story yet. They didn't know whose chair it was. They didn't know who the dog belonged to. And they certainly didn't know why the animal never missed a single morning. But the truth was something far deeper than simple loyalty. Because somewhere not far from that quiet cafe, in a white hospital room filled with the faint scent of antiseptic and morning lights spilling across the floor, a man lay in a bed with no memory of the dog who was still waiting for him. The next morning arrived wrapped in a pale gray mist that clung to the streets of Ashford like a quiet secret the town had not yet decided to share. The cafe lights flickered on just before sunrise, casting a warm amber glow across the sidewalk, while Linda Harper unlocked the front door and stepped outside with a broom in one hand and a steaming cup of coffee in the other. The air smelled like damp pavement and roasted beans, the kind of scent that settles into a place after years of early mornings and familiar faces. She swept the patio slowly, listening to the soft scrape of bristles against concrete, when she noticed the familiar silhouette appearing at the far end of Maple Street. The German shepherd moved with the same calm certainty as always, his paws steady against the cool ground, his thick coat shifting slightly in the morning breeze. Linda glanced at the old clock hanging inside the cafe window. 8:10. Not a minute earlier. Not a minute late. The dog reached the gate, nudged it open with his nose, and stepped onto the patio like he belonged there more than anyone else. His amber eyes briefly met Linda's before. He walked past her without hesitation, heading directly to the same wooden chair near the window. The chair remained exactly where it had been the day before, pushed halfway beneath the table, its surface worn smooth from years of elbows resting against it. The dog stopped beside it, turned once in a slow, deliberate circle, and sat down with quiet patience. His posture was upright, almost formal, the kind of stillness that suggested he was not waiting for food or kindness, but for someone whose absence had not yet changed the rules of his routine. Linda leaned against the broom and watched him for a moment. She had lived in Ashford for nearly 20 years, long enough to know every regular customer, every delivery driver, every neighbor who stopped by for pie on Sunday mornings. Yet she had never seen this dog before the autumn leaves began to fall. She poured a little water into a metal bowl and placed it near the table. The dog glanced at it, but did not move. His attention stayed fixed on the door. The bell above it rang as the first customers of the morning stepped inside, bringing with them the chill of early November and the quiet murmur of small-town conversation. A pair of construction workers ordered eggs and toast. A college student claimed the corner booth with a laptop and a textbook thicker than a phone book. Frank Dillard shuffled in next, pulling his wool cap down over his ears as he rubbed his hands together for warmth. He paused when he saw the dog already sitting beside the chair. "Well, I will be," he muttered softly. "He beat me again." Frank settled at the next table and took a sip of his coffee while watching the animal through the corner of his eye. Each time the cafe door opened, the dog lifted his head slightly. Not with excitement, with expectation, the kind of quiet hope that had not yet learned the meaning of disappointment. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour. Plates clinked. Coffee was poured. Outside, the morning fog slowly thinned until sunlight began slipping through the glass window in long pale stripes across the floor and table. The empty chair glowed softly in the light. Still untouched. Still waiting. Frank finally leaned toward Linda as she passed by with a tray of biscuits. "You ever seen a dog wait like that before?" he asked. Linda shook her head slowly, her eyes drifting toward the German shepherd once more. "Not like this," she said quietly. "That dog is not just passing time." Outside on the patio, the dog remained beside the chair, calm and silent, as if the hours meant nothing to him. Because somewhere deep within the instincts that guided him back to this place every morning was a memory stronger than hunger, stronger than weather, stronger even than time itself. And in a quiet hospital room across town, the man whose scent still lingered in that chair was beginning to wake into another day without remembering why a loyal soul was still waiting for him. By late morning the cafe patio had grown quieter, the rush of breakfast fading into the slower rhythm of midday. Yet the German shepherd remained beside the chair with the same unwavering patience that had brought him there at 8:10. The sun climbed higher over Ashford, warming the brick sidewalks and sending thin ribbons of light across Maple Street, where delivery trucks rolled past at a gentle pace. Inside the cafe, the clatter of dishes softened, and the scent of cinnamon rolls drifted through the open doorway. Frank Dillard finished his second cup of coffee and leaned back in his chair, studying the dog more carefully than before. There was something about the animal that did not match the image of a stray. His coat was thick and well kept, the deep sable fur along his back catching the sunlight in shades of bronze and black. A faded leather collar circled his neck, worn smooth by time but still strong, and hanging from it was a small metal tag that glinted every time the dog shifted his head. Frank noticed it when the dog finally stood for a moment and stretched his long front legs before sitting again beside the chair. The movement was graceful, disciplined, almost military in its precision. "That is no ordinary dog," Frank murmured quietly to Linda when she stepped outside carrying a tray of clean mugs. Linda followed his gaze and nodded slowly. She had noticed the same thing during the past few weeks. The dog never barked at strangers. He never chased birds or sniffed through trash cans like most wandering animals did. Instead, he behaved with the calm awareness of a trained companion, watching the door, listening to footsteps, measuring the room with silent attention. A young boy walking past the cafe paused near the patio fence and crouched down to look at him. "Hey, buddy," the boy whispered gently. The dog glanced at him for a moment, tail giving a small respectful wag, but his eyes soon returned to the cafe entrance as though the door itself held the only answer that mattered. Linda stepped closer and finally bent down beside the animal. She reached carefully toward the metal tag hanging from the collar and brushed away a thin layer of dust with her thumb. The engraving caught the sunlight clearly enough for her to read. Daniel Carter. Beneath the name was a smaller line of text that simply read United States Marine Corps. Linda felt a quiet chill run through her chest that had nothing to do with the cool November air. She looked again at the chair beside the dog, the same chair that had remained empty for weeks now, and suddenly the pieces began to settle into place. This was not just a loyal animal returning to a familiar spot. This was a partner honoring a promise no one else in town even knew existed. Across the patio, the dog lifted his head slightly as the cafe door opened again, amber eyes bright with the same patient hope he carried every morning. A young delivery driver stepped through with a box of pastries, and for a brief second the dog leaned forward, as though the shape of the man might match the memory he had carried for so long. But the scent was wrong. The footsteps were wrong. The door closed again, and the dog quietly settled back beside the chair. In another part of Ashford, several miles away, a hospital window reflected the same rising sunlight as a man named Daniel Carter sat slowly upright in his bed. He looked around the unfamiliar room with calm but distant eyes, searching for something he could not name. Somewhere deep in the quiet corners of his memory, there was a feeling that someone had once waited for him every morning. But the face attached to that feeling remained just beyond reach. The afternoon light slowly shifted across the patio as the hours moved forward, turning the wooden table beside the window into a small island of gold and shadow. The German shepherd remained beside the chair with the same quiet discipline that had already become familiar to everyone in the cafe. Cars rolled past on Maple Street, their engines humming softly, and the breeze carried the faint scent of fallen leaves drifting along the sidewalk. A few new customers arrived for lunch, but most of them paused for a moment when they noticed the dog sitting so still beside the empty seat. Some whispered to each other. Others simply watched in silence before stepping inside. Word about the waiting dog had begun to travel through Ashford. Not loudly, not like gossip, but in the quiet way small towns pass stories from one person to another over coffee cups and front porch conversations. Inside the cafe, Linda Harper stood behind the counter, wiping down a row of ceramic mugs while Frank Dillard leaned against the edge of the bar, his attention still drifting toward the patio. Daniel Carter, Frank repeated slowly, thinking about the name on the tag Linda had read earlier that morning. The name sounded familiar to him in the distant way that memories sometimes do, like a melody heard once long ago. You think he lived around here? Frank asked. Linda shrugged slightly, but her eyes stayed thoughtful. If he did, he must have sat in that chair a lot, she said quietly. Dogs do not return to places like that unless they remember something important. Outside, the German shepherd lifted his head again when the cafe door opened and a young couple stepped out carrying paper cups of coffee. The dog watched them politely, but made no move to approach. Instead, he glanced once more toward the chair beside him, as if checking that it had remained exactly where it belonged. The couple walked past the patio gate, and the sound of their conversation faded down the sidewalk. The dog's ears lowered gently, and he returned to his patient watch over the door. Across town, the hospital corridors were calm in the early afternoon, filled with the quiet rhythm of rolling carts and distant voices speaking in careful tones. In a room on the second floor, Daniel Carter sat near the window while a nurse adjusted the blanket across his lap. The sunlight resting on the floor reminded him of something he could not quite grasp. There was a warmth in the memory, a place where mornings felt simple and familiar, where the smell of coffee drifted through the air and the scrape of a chair against wood meant someone he trusted had just arrived. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, trying to follow that feeling further, but the memory slipped away like fog lifting from a lake. The nurse smiled gently when she noticed the distant look in his eyes. Sometimes memories come back slowly, she said. Daniel nodded, though he was not certain what he was searching for. All he knew was that somewhere beyond the walls of the hospital there was a quiet sense of unfinished routine, as if part of his life had continued moving forward without him. Back at the cafe, the German shepherd shifted slightly and placed one paw closer to the leg of the chair, resting against it in a gesture that looked almost protective. The afternoon sun touched the metal tag on his collar again, and the engraved name glimmered faintly. Daniel Carter. The dog's amber eyes stayed fixed on the door, steady and hopeful, as though he understood something the rest of the town had only just begun to notice. Because loyalty does not measure time the same way people do. To the dog waiting beside that chair, the days had not truly changed at all. Morning would come again. The door would open again, and sooner or later, the man he remembered would walk through it. The sky above Ashford turned a softer shade of blue as the afternoon began to lean toward evening, and the steady rhythm of Maple Street slowed the way it always did when the workday started to fade. The cafe patio had grown quiet again, the lunch crowd gone, leaving only the gentle creak of the hanging sign and the distant hum of a pickup truck passing at the far end of the block. Yet the German shepherd remained beside the same chair with the same calm patience that had defined every hour of the day. His ears shifted occasionally when footsteps echoed on the sidewalk, and once in a while he lifted his head toward the cafe door, hopeful but composed, as though he had learned that waiting did not require urgency. Linda stepped outside again, carrying a folded kitchen towel over her shoulder. She paused beside the table and studied the dog more closely than she ever had before. There was a quiet dignity in the way he held himself, a kind of discipline that reminded her of soldiers she had seen during parades on Memorial Day. His posture was straight but relaxed, his gaze focused yet gentle, and when the wind moved through his coat, the thick fur revealed faint scars of old adventures that had long since healed. Linda crouched slowly beside him and spoke in a soft voice that carried warmth but no expectation. "You must have had quite a partner, did you not?" The dog glanced toward her, amber eyes thoughtful, as though he recognized the kindness in her tone even if the words meant little to him. For a brief moment his tail brushed the wooden leg of the chair beside him, the quiet movement sounding almost like a small promise. Linda looked at the metal tag again and whispered the name written there. Daniel Carter. The name settled into the air like a memory waiting to be understood. Inside the cafe, Frank Dillard had been listening through the open window. He stepped outside with his coffee mug and leaned against the railing. "You know," he said slowly, "there was a Marine from this town a few years back. Carter sounds familiar. Might have been the same fellow." Linda turned toward him. "Did he come here?" Frank shrugged gently, but nodded toward the chair. "If he did, I would guess that was his seat." The two of them stood quietly for a moment, watching the dog who still guarded that place with quiet determination. The late afternoon sunlight slipped lower now, stretching long golden lines across the patio floor. A breeze carried the smell of pine from the hills outside town, and somewhere nearby a screen door closed with a soft clap. The German shepherd lifted his head again as the cafe door opened behind them. A young waitress stepped out to gather empty cups from another table. The dog watched her pass, but remained beside the chair, loyal to the silent routine that had brought him there day after day. Miles away in the hospital room, Daniel Carter stood carefully beside his bed, while a physical therapist encouraged him to take a few slow steps toward the window. Each movement was steady but cautious, as though his body remembered strength that his mind had not fully reclaimed. When he reached the glass, he looked out across the town skyline and felt that strange sense again, the feeling that somewhere in Ashford there was a place where mornings belonged to him. He could almost smell coffee in the air. He could almost hear the scrape of a wooden chair being pulled out beside a table. But the image would not come clearly. Back on Maple Street, the dog gently rested his chin against the edge of the seat as the sun dipped closer to the horizon. His eyes remained calm, filled not with sadness but with the simple certainty that tomorrow morning would arrive just like the last. And when it did, he would return to this place once more, ready to greet the man whose presence still lived in the memory of that chair. Evening settled gently over Ashford as the last light of the day faded behind the low hills beyond town, painting the sky in soft shades of amber and deep blue. The cafe patio had grown nearly silent now, the earlier conversations replaced by the distant chirp of crickets and the quiet rustle of dry leaves skimming across Maple Street. Inside the cafe, Linda Harper wiped the final table of the evening while the warm scent of fresh bread lingered in the air. Through the window, she could still see the German shepherd resting beside the same chair, his posture calm but alert, as though the passing hours had not weakened his purpose. The golden light from the cafe lamps spilled across the patio and brushed softly against his fur, giving the dog a quiet glow that made him look almost like a guardian carved from shadow and patience. Frank Dillard stepped outside again, pulling his old jacket tighter around his shoulders as the evening air turned cooler. He leaned on the railing and watched the dog for a moment before speaking quietly. "You know something, Linda," he said slowly. "Most dogs would have wandered off by now." Linda nodded gently, her eyes still on the patient animal beside the chair. "Most dogs are not waiting for someone they love," she replied. The German shepherd lifted his head when the cafe door opened once more, his ears rising with the same hopeful motion that had greeted every sound of footsteps throughout the day. A young man walked out carrying a backpack and glanced down at the dog with quiet curiosity before heading down the sidewalk. The dog watched him pass, then calmly returned his gaze to the empty seat beside him, as if confirming that the place had remained safe through another passing hour. The chair itself had begun to gather the cool of evening, the wood holding the memory of sunlight that had warmed it only hours before. The dog rested one paw against its leg again, the small gesture gentle but protective, as though he understood that the seats still belonged to someone who had simply not arrived yet. Across town, the hospital hallways glowed under soft fluorescent lights, while Daniel Carter sat quietly in a chair beside his window. The evening sky outside carried the same fading colors that drifted above Maple Street, though Daniel did not know why the sight made his chest feel strangely full. The physical therapist had left a few minutes earlier, reminding him to rest before tomorrow's session, but Daniel remained awake, studying the darkening horizon as if searching for something beyond the glass. Somewhere inside him was the faint impression of a routine he had once followed every day. A walk down a familiar street, the warm smell of coffee, the quiet comfort of a place where mornings began slowly. And always, just beside him, the steady presence of someone who never left his side. Daniel rubbed his hands together thoughtfully, trying once again to follow the thread of that memory, but it remained just out of reach. Back at the cafe, the lights inside began to dim as Linda locked the front door for the night. She stepped outside one last time and looked down at the dog beside the chair. "You should find a warm place to sleep tonight," she said softly, though her voice carried little certainty that he would leave. The German shepherd looked at her calmly, tail brushing the ground once, but he remained where he was. The town of Ashford slowly grew quiet as the stars began to appear overhead, yet the dog stayed beside the chair through the cooling night air, faithful to the silent promise he carried in his heart. Because to him the day had not ended with the closing of the cafe. It had only become another chapter in the long wait for the moment when the door would open and the man he remembered would finally walk back into the seat that had never stopped belonging to him. The night passed quietly over Ashford, and sometime before dawn a cool mist settled along Maple Street, softening the edges of storefronts and streetlights until the whole town seemed wrapped in a gentle hush. The cafe remained dark behind its windows, chairs turned upside down on tables, and the faint smell of roasted coffee still lingering in the air from the day before. Outside on the patio, the German shepherd had not wandered far. When the first gray light of morning crept across the sky, he was already awake, rising slowly from the spot where he had rested beside the chair through the night. He stretched his long legs with a calm, practiced motion and glanced toward the empty street, as if confirming that the new day had arrived exactly as expected. The town clock several blocks away struck 8 soft chimes in the distance, and the dog's ears lifted slightly at the familiar rhythm. A few minutes later, Linda Harper turned the corner at the end of Maple Street carrying her keys and a paper bag of fresh pastries from the bakery down the road. She stopped when she saw the dog already waiting by the patio gate, his silhouette steady against the pale morning light. "Well now," she said gently, unlocking the gate. "Looks like you never really left." The dog stepped inside without hesitation, paws moving with the same quiet certainty he had shown every morning before. He crossed the patio and returned directly to the chair beside the window, circling once before sitting down as though the past day had simply paused rather than ended. Linda unlocked the cafe door and switched on the lights inside, the warm glow spilling across the patio floor and catching the metal tag on the dog's collar. The engraved name glimmered again. Daniel Carter. The letters seemed to hold a story the town had only begun to understand. Inside the cafe, the machines hummed back to life, and the smell of brewing coffee slowly filled the air. Frank Dillard arrived a few minutes later, his old pickup truck rumbling into a parking spot near the curb. When he stepped out and saw the dog sitting beside the chair exactly as before, he shook his head with quiet amazement. "Morning, partner," Frank said softly as he approached the patio. The dog glanced at him, politely, but kept his gaze drifting toward the door. Frank leaned against the railing and studied the scene once more. The empty chair, the patient dog, the soft steam rising from fresh coffee inside the cafe. It felt less like coincidence now and more like a promise waiting to be completed. Across town in the hospital room, Daniel Carter stood beside the window again as sunlight slipped between the buildings of Ashford. The morning air carried a faint scent through the open crack of the glass that made him pause for a moment. Coffee, warm bread, something familiar. He rested one hand against the window frame, his thoughts drifting toward the quiet shape of a place he almost remembered. In his mind, there was a small table near a window, a wooden chair pulled out beside it, and on the ground, near his feet, the steady presence of someone who always arrived before he did. The image faded before he could hold on to it, but the feeling remained strong enough to make him whisper a name he did not realize he knew. Atlas. Back on Maple Street, the German shepherd lifted his head suddenly, ears rising toward the morning breeze as though he had heard something carried across the distance. His amber eyes brightened for a brief moment before settling again on the cafe door, waiting with the same unwavering loyalty that had guided him through every sunrise since the day his partner had disappeared from that chair. The morning unfolded slowly across Ashford as the sun climbed higher above the rooftops and the quiet rhythm of Maple Street returned to life once again. Inside the cafe, the soft murmur of conversation began to fill the air as regular customers arrived one by one, greeting Linda Harper with familiar smiles, while the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the open patio door. Outside, the German shepherd remained beside the same wooden chair, calm and patient as always, his amber eyes following every small movement near the entrance. A delivery truck rolled past, its tires humming against the pavement, and somewhere down the block a bell chimed from the hardware store as it opened for the day. The town had begun to accept the presence of the waiting dog as part of the morning routine, like the rising sun or the sound of the bakery ovens starting up before dawn. Frank. Dillard settled into his usual seat with a cup of black coffee and glanced toward the patio with quiet curiosity. The dog had not missed a single morning in weeks now, and something about that steady loyalty stirred a feeling deep in Frank's chest. He leaned toward Linda as she wiped the counter nearby. "You know," he said slowly, "if that Marine is still around somewhere, someone ought to find him." Linda looked toward the patio again where the dog sat beside the chair with unwavering patience. The metal tag on his collar caught the sunlight once more, the name Daniel Carter shining softly against the worn steel. "Maybe the town will," she replied thoughtfully. Outside, the dog lifted his head as a small group of people passed along the sidewalk. Among them was a young woman pushing a stroller who slowed her steps when she noticed the animal sitting beside the empty seat. She smiled gently and whispered something to the child inside the stroller before continuing on her way. The dog watched them go but soon returned his attention to the cafe door, his focus steady as ever. Across town, the hospital room had grown brighter with the full light of morning as Daniel Carter stood beside the window again, studying the streets below. The physical therapist had encouraged him to walk a little farther today, and though each step felt unfamiliar, he moved with careful determination. When he paused near the window, a strange thought crossed his mind. Not quite a memory, but something close to it. There was a street somewhere in this town where mornings felt warmer than they should. A place where coffee and sunlight met at the same table. And near that table there had always been a loyal companion waiting quietly at his side. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of traffic drifting upward from the streets below. For a brief second, the image of a sable-colored dog flashed across his mind, sitting proudly beside a chair as though guarding it for someone who had simply stepped away for a moment. The vision faded almost as quickly as it appeared, leaving Daniel standing quietly beside the window with a sense that something important waited beyond the hospital walls. Back on Maple Street, the German shepherd shifted slightly and rested his chin near the edge of the chair, the simple gesture filled with quiet devotion. The breeze carried the faint sound of the town clock striking the hour, and the dog's ears lifted once again toward the familiar rhythm. Somewhere beyond the hills of Ashford, a memory was slowly finding its way home. And though the people of the town could not yet see it, the patient dog beside the chair seemed to understand that the long wait was beginning to move toward its final chapter. The late morning sun warmed Maple Street with a gentle glow that made the windows of the cafe shine like polished glass. And by now the story of the waiting dog had begun to spread quietly through Ashford in the way small towns carry unusual things from porch to porch and table to table. A few people had started stopping by the patio simply to see him, though most kept a respectful distance once they noticed the quiet seriousness in the German shepherd's posture. He was not performing for attention. He was working in the only way loyalty understands, sitting beside the chair, watching the door, waiting for the man whose absence had not yet convinced him to give up. Linda Harper stepped outside again with a small bowl of water and placed it beside the table. The dog glanced at her briefly with calm appreciation before returning his gaze toward the cafe entrance. His ears moved slightly with every sound, measuring footsteps, voices, the soft jingle of the bell above the door. Each time the door opened, his head lifted with quiet hope, and each time a stranger stepped through, his body settled again into patient stillness. Frank Dillard watched the scene from his usual spot with thoughtful eyes. "That dog is remembering something the rest of us do not know," he said quietly into his coffee cup. Linda nodded, the words settling into the air between them like a truth that had been waiting to be spoken. Across town, Daniel Carter had begun another slow walk down the hospital hallway with the help of a physical therapist. The polished floor reflected the pale overhead lights as he moved carefully step by step, his mind drifting through fragments of sensation that had started appearing more often during the past few days. A wooden chair, a warm cafe window, the steady rhythm of paws resting against the floor beside him. The therapist noticed the distant look in his eyes and asked gently if he was feeling tired. Daniel shook his head slowly. "No," he answered. "Just remembering something I cannot quite see yet." He paused near a window halfway down the hall and looked out toward the town beyond the hospital parking lot. The rooftops of Ashford stretched quietly toward the hills, and somewhere among those streets there was a place that seemed to pull at his memory like a thread waiting to be followed. Back at the cafe, the German shepherd shifted slightly and rose to his feet for the first time that morning. The movement caught the attention of several people inside who watched through the window with curiosity. The dog stretched calmly and stepped once around the chair before settling again beside it. But this time his body faced the sidewalk rather than the door. His nose lifted toward the breeze as if he were listening for something carried across the distance. The air moved gently through the patio and stirred the fur along his neck, while the metal tag on his collar caught the sunlight again. Daniel Carter. The engraved name shimmered quietly while the dog's eyes searched the street beyond Maple Street's slow traffic. In that moment, something inside him seemed to awaken, not excitement exactly, but a deeper alertness, like the recognition of a scent remembered after a long absence. Inside the cafe, Frank leaned forward slightly. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Linda watched carefully as the dog's ears rose higher than they had all morning. The German shepherd remained beside the chair, but his attention had turned toward the road leading into town, his body still yet ready, as though the long wait he had guarded for so many mornings had suddenly begun to change shape. Because sometimes loyalty knows the moment hope returns long before people do. Toward the patio door with a tray of cups, and paused when she noticed the dog standing now instead of sitting. His body remained beside the chair, loyal to the place he had guarded for so many days. But his gaze was fixed down Maple Street toward the distant curve where the road entered town. His tail moved slowly once, not with excitement, but with recognition. Frank Dillard noticed the change as well, and set his coffee down quietly. "Something has his attention," he murmured. The street beyond the cafe remained ordinary at first glance. A few cars rolled past. A cyclist pedaled slowly along the sidewalk. A delivery van turned the corner near the grocery store. Yet the dog continued watching the road with the still concentration of an animal that had just recognized a long-forgotten scent carried through the wind. Across town, Daniel Carter had just finished another slow walk through the hospital hallway when he paused near the entrance doors. The sunlight outside spilled across the polished floor in warm bands of gold, and for reasons he could not fully explain, he felt a sudden urge to step outside. The therapist noticed the look in his eyes and smiled gently. "Fresh air might do you some good," she said. Daniel nodded and moved toward the exit, each step steadier than the one before. The moment the doors opened, the cool autumn air brushed across his face, carrying with it a mixture of scents from the town beyond the hospital grounds. Coffee, pine trees from the hills, and something else he could not name, but felt deeply familiar. Daniel stood still for a moment as the strange sense of recognition stirred inside him again. Back at the cafe, the German shepherd shifted his weight and took 2 slow steps forward, moving just beyond the chair for the first time that morning. His amber eyes remained locked on the road, and now his tail moved again with a quiet rhythm that made Linda step closer to the patio railing. "Frank," she whispered softly, "I think he knows something." The dog took another step forward and then stopped, as though remembering the promise he had made to the empty chair behind him. For a moment, he looked back at the seat, touching its leg gently with his nose as if asking permission to leave it unguarded. Then he turned, again toward the road, standing tall in the sunlight with his ears lifted high. Miles away, the hospital shuttle bus began rolling slowly toward Maple Street, carrying a few patients who had been cleared for short walks through town. Daniel Carter sat near the window, watching the familiar streets pass by with a growing sense that something important waited somewhere ahead. The bus turned the corner toward the small cafe district, and at that exact moment the German shepherd beside the chair let out a soft breath that sounded almost like a sigh of relief. Because after countless mornings of waiting, the scent he had trusted with unwavering faith was finally coming back down the road toward him. The shuttle bus slowed as it turned onto Maple Street, its tires rolling gently over the worn asphalt while the quiet life of the town carried on as usual around it. Inside the cafe, Linda Harper had stepped closer to the patio door, her eyes fixed on the German shepherd who now stood fully upright near the chair he had guarded for so many mornings. The dog's body was still but alert, his ears lifted high and his gaze locked toward the approaching road with an intensity that made everyone inside the cafe fall silent without fully understanding why. Frank Dillard leaned forward in his chair, following the direction of the dog's eyes until he noticed the white hospital shuttle easing toward the curb a short distance down the street. The bus came to a gentle stop, and its door opened with a soft mechanical sigh. A few passengers stepped down one by one, moving slowly onto the sidewalk under the warm light of the late morning sun. For a moment, nothing remarkable seemed to happen. People adjusted their jackets. One woman thanked the driver before walking toward the pharmacy across the street. But the German shepherd remained frozen in place beside the chair, his nose lifted slightly into the breeze, as though every scent in the world had suddenly narrowed to one familiar thread. Then a tall man stepped carefully down from the bus. He moved slowly, steadying himself on the rail as his feet touched the pavement. His posture carried the quiet strength of someone still recovering. But there was also something unmistakably familiar about the way he stood, the way his shoulders settled as he looked around the street. With thoughtful eyes, Daniel Carter paused beside the bus, breathing in the cool autumn air as though he had been searching for that exact moment without knowing why. The scent of coffee drifted toward him from the cafe patio, and his gaze followed it instinctively across the street. Inside the cafe, Frank whispered softly, "Linda, I think that is him." Outside, the German shepherd took a single step forward, then another. His tail moved once in a slow, uncertain arc as if the years of waiting had suddenly turned fragile in the space of a few seconds. Daniel began walking down the sidewalk toward the cafe, his eyes drawn to the patio without understanding the reason behind it. Something about the place stirred the quiet memory that had been growing inside him all morning. The wooden tables, the window catching the sunlight, the faint sound of a chair leg touching the ground. When he reached the patio gate, he paused again, noticing the German shepherd standing a few yards away beside the empty chair. The dog had not rushed forward. He simply stood there watching, his amber eyes searching the man's face with a patience deeper than excitement. Daniel felt his chest tighten slightly as he looked at the animal. There was a familiarity in the dog's posture, in the calm intelligence behind those eyes, that stirred something deep within his mind. He stepped through the gate slowly, the wooden latch clicking softly behind him. For a long second, neither of them moved. The town seemed to hold its breath. The breeze rustled the leaves along the sidewalk. And then the German shepherd took 2 quiet steps closer, lifting his head just enough for the sunlight to catch the worn metal tag on his collar. Daniel's eyes followed the glimmer of the tag as the engraved letters came into view. Daniel Carter. The sight of his own name resting against the dog's chest struck him like a forgotten echo returning at last. His voice came out softly, almost uncertain. Atlas. At the sound of that single word, the dog's tail began to move again, slow at first, and then stronger, the long wait finally reaching the moment it had been guarding all along. For a moment, the world around the patio seemed to grow completely still, as if even the quiet town of Ashford understood that something important was unfolding. In the small space between the man and the dog, the German shepherd's tail moved slowly at first, then with growing certainty as the sound of his name reached him after so many mornings of silence. Atlas stepped closer, his paws moving carefully across the wooden boards of the patio until he stood only a few feet away from Daniel Carter. His amber eyes searched the man's face with deep attention, as though confirming the truth of something he had believed without question for all those long days. Daniel remained where he was, his breath steady but his expression filled with the quiet confusion of memories returning piece by piece. The sight of the dog stirred something powerful inside him, not a single clear memory but a flood of familiar feelings. Early morning walks, the steady rhythm of paws beside his boots, the calm presence of a loyal partner who had never once left his side. Atlas lowered his head slightly and stepped forward again until the distance between them disappeared. Then he gently pressed his nose against Daniel's hand. The touch was soft and careful, the way a dog greets someone he has loved for a very long time. Daniel's fingers instinctively moved into the thick fur along the dog's neck, and the simple motion felt natural in a way that surprised him. For a moment, he closed his eyes as the warmth of the familiar coat settled beneath his palm. Inside the cafe, Linda Harper stood near the door with her hand covering her mouth, while Frank Dillard watched quietly from his seat. Neither of them spoke. Some moments did not need words. Atlas lifted his head and looked directly into Daniel's eyes again, his tail now moving in a steady rhythm that filled the patio with a quiet sense of relief. Daniel studied the dog carefully, the pieces of memory slowly fitting together like pages returning to the same story. The worn leather collar, the engraved metal tag resting against his chest, the calm intelligence in those watchful eyes. "You waited for me," Daniel said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Atlas answered with a small breath that sounded almost like a happy sigh before leaning gently against Daniel's leg. The simple contact seemed to steady both of them at once. Daniel reached down and rested his hand on the dog's shoulder while the sunlight filtered through the cafe window behind them, warming the wooden chair that had remained empty for so long. He glanced at the seat and felt a sudden flash of recognition that made him smile faintly. Mornings spent at that table, coffee steaming in the cool air, Atlas resting beside the chair while the town slowly woke around them. The memory was not perfect yet, but it was enough. Atlas turned his head toward the chair for a moment, and then back to Daniel, as if reminding him that the place had always been theirs. Daniel pulled the chair out slowly and sat down, the legs scraping gently against the patio floor. Atlas settled beside him immediately, lying down with the calm satisfaction of a promise finally fulfilled. Across the patio, the town of Ashford seemed to breathe again as people resumed their quiet routines, though everyone who had witnessed the moment knew they had just seen something rare and beautiful, a loyalty that had never once doubted the return of the man it loved. And as Daniel rested his hand on Atlas's back, he realized that the piece of his life he had been searching for all along had been waiting patiently beside an empty chair. The late morning light rested gently across the patio as Daniel Carter sat quietly in the wooden chair that had waited so long for him to return. The warmth of the sun touched the table beside him, while the familiar smell of coffee drifted through the open door of the cafe, carrying with it the calm rhythm of a small town that had just witnessed something it would remember for many years. Atlas lay beside the chair with his head resting across Daniel's boot, the same place he had guarded through countless mornings of waiting. The dog's breathing was slow and steady now, the patient tension that had lived in his body for weeks finally fading into quiet contentment. Daniel ran his hand gently through the thick fur along Atlas's back, feeling the simple comfort of a bond that had survived time, distance, and the fragile gaps of memory. Across the patio, Linda Harper stepped outside with 2 mugs of coffee and placed one carefully on the table. Daniel looked up with a grateful smile that still carried the softness of someone rediscovering pieces of his own life. "Thank you," he said quietly. Linda nodded, once and glanced down at Atlas with warm eyes. "He never missed a morning," she said. "Not one." Daniel looked at the dog again, the words settling deep inside him as more fragments of memory slowly returned. Early patrol mornings when Atlas had walked beside him without command. Long days when the dog's quiet presence had carried more comfort than any conversation. And after all of that, the simple habit of stopping at this cafe where the world seemed slower and the chair by the window had always been theirs. Frank Dillard stepped onto the patio and tipped his cap politely. "Looks like he knew you were coming back," he said with a small smile. Daniel glanced toward Atlas again and nodded softly. He always did know, he replied. The dog lifted his head slightly at the sound of Daniel's voice, his tail brushing gently against the wooden floor as if confirming the truth of that quiet statement. The empty chair that had once held nothing but waiting was no longer empty at all. Daniel leaned back slightly, letting the warm sunlight settle across the table while Atlas remained beside him exactly where he belonged. The simple scene held a kind of peace that could not be rushed or explained, only felt. Around them, Maple Street continued its quiet routine as people walked past the cafe, some pausing to glance at the familiar sight of the dog and the man finally sitting together again. No one interrupted them. Some stories were meant to end in silence rather than applause. After a moment, Daniel placed his hand gently against Atlas's collar and felt the cool metal tag resting beneath his fingers. The engraved letters caught the light once more before settling back into shadow. Daniel Carter, United States Marine Corps. Atlas shifted closer and rested his chin across Daniel's boot again, the steady contact carrying the simple message he had guarded through every sunrise of the long wait. The promise had never been forgotten. Daniel looked out across the street, breathing in the calm air of Ashford as the final pieces of memory quietly found their place inside him. And beside him, the loyal German shepherd closed his eyes for the first peaceful morning he had known in a very long time, because the chair was empty no longer and the one he had waited for had finally come home.